In the cold expanse of space, the Exodus drifts, humanity's last hope in the dark void. Earth is a memory, its resources exhausted, its cities in ruins, but survival is just the beginning. As the crew of the Exodus faces unimaginable challenges both from within and beyond, they must confront the ultimate question. Can they find a new home and rebuild, or will they fall into extinction? Lost in space, hope is running out. Salvation, or extinction, takes you on an unforgettable journey through fear, hope, and the struggle for survival. Get ready for a high-stakes, emotional ride. You won't want to miss what happens next. The stars stretched on forever, vast and indifferent to the small ship drifting silently through the void. The Exodus was a ship of salvation, or so they hoped. Humanity's last hope, leaving behind the ashes of a dying Earth, was now scattered among the cold stars, trying to forge a new life. But for the crew, the true battle was only just beginning. Captain Helena Core stood in the observation deck, her eyes fixed on the distant stars. The Earth was a memory, that slipping further away with every passing moment. Her chest tightened as she stared into the abyss. A heavy silence hung in the air, thick with the weight of their journey and the uncertainties ahead. She gripped the railing, her fingers turning white. They had survived the hardest part, the escape from Earth, but the hardest challenge had only just begun. The mission was clear: find a new home, settle humanity's future, and rebuild from the ground up. But nothing was ever simple in the vast unknown of space. Behind her, the soft hum of the ship's engines created a subtle rhythm that filled the otherwise still environment. Her thoughts were interrupted by the low, steady voice of Dr. Felix Riker, the ship's chief scientist. "Helena, the oxygen levels are stable, but we're burning through the reserves faster than expected. I'll need to make adjustments soon if we're going to make it through the next few months." His voice was calm, controlled, but there was an underlying tension in his words. Helena turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Make it work, Felix. We don't have the luxury of time." Felix didn't respond immediately, his gaze turning toward the complex readouts on the control panel. The glow of the instruments cast a faint light on his sharp features. The lines on his face, etched by years of hard work, deepened as he processed the data. It's not just about making it work. The systems are stretched thin. The whole structure of this mission is on borrowed time. Helena's jaw clenched. She had no time for these doubts, but part of her couldn't ignore the truth in his words. She had known from the start this wouldn't be easy, but the thought of failure, of losing everything, was unbearable. And still, she didn't let the fear show. The crew needed leadership. They needed someone who could steady the ship when the storm came. She had always been that person. "I know," she said finally, her voice low but resolute. "We're not just fighting against the odds, we're fighting for our future." Felix nodded, but his eyes were filled with an exhaustion that made it hard for her to ignore. The weight of survival was starting to break them all, piece by piece. This wasn't just a journey across the stars. It was a test of their very humanity. Later that day, the crew gathered in the mess hall for their daily briefing. The cold, sterile walls of the room stood in stark contrast to the warmth of the conversation, but the underlying tension was palpable. There was an air of resignation that no one dared address directly. Ava Sloan, the ship's agricultural engineer, sat at one end of the table, flipping through her data pad. Her brow furrowed as she reviewed the reports on the crop yields that had been planted in the hydroponics bay. The results weren't good. The plants were barely surviving, and the system that was supposed to sustain them was failing. "I'm doing everything I can, but the resources are limited," Ava said, her voice tight with frustration. "I can't grow enough food to sustain everyone if this keeps up." Helena glanced at her, the weight of the mission's impossible demands hanging in the air between them. "We will make do," she replied simply. It was all she could say. What else was there to say when hope itself felt so fragile? Kai Tanaka, the ship's seasoned pilot, leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful but distant. He had spent his entire career navigating the stars, but even he could sense the change in the air. The crew was unraveling, little by little. He had always believed that humanity could rise above any challenge, but this was different. This was a test that went far beyond flying through asteroid fields or surviving space radiation. This was survival at its most raw, most unforgiving. We're running out of options, Kai said quietly. Not just food or resources, but time. The farther we go, the harder it's going to be to find anything close to habitable. The stars out here are cold, empty, and the longer we stay on this ship, the more we risk losing everything we've worked for. Helena stood, her eyes narrowing as she looked around the room. There was fear in their voices, fear she hadn't heard since Earth's final days. She couldn't afford that fear to take root in them now, not when the future was so uncertain. She wasn't going to let them break now, not after everything they had endured to get here. We don't have the luxury of fear, she said firmly, her voice cutting through the room. We will survive this, together. We have no other choice. A long silence followed her words. The crew exchanged uncertain glances, each person wrestling with their own doubts. But no one spoke up. There was nothing left to say. They all knew the stakes. As days turned into weeks, the tension aboard the Exodus grew. The vastness of space pressed in on them from all sides, a constant reminder of how small and fragile their existence was. The ship was a beautiful, state-of-the-art marvel, capable of surviving the harshest environments, but it was only as strong as its crew. Helena spent long hours in the control room, staring out into the empty blackness. She had seen the damage that Earth's collapse had done to her people, to her home, but this was different. This was the beginning of something new, something they had all fought for. They weren't just escaping Earth, they were starting again. But deep down, Helena wondered if it was even possible. Could they really survive? Could humanity truly rebuild itself? Or were they destined to repeat the same mistakes that led to Earth's downfall? The night stretched on in silence, the stars outside offering no answers, no comfort. But within the walls of the Exodus, something else stirred. A quiet determination, a flicker of hope. They were still alive, they were still moving forward. And that in the end was all they could ask for. The days aboard the Exodus stretched on, each one blending into the next. The crew had settled into a routine, one that kept them alive, but one that also began to feel like a slow march toward an uncertain future. Despite their best efforts, the ship's systems were starting to show signs of strain. The food production system, which had once seemed so promising, was barely keeping pace with the growing needs of the crew. The hydroponics bay, a lifeline for the future, was now a battleground. The crops were failing, and with each passing day, Ava's frustration grew. Ava Sloan stood in the hydroponics bay, wiping sweat from her brow as she adjusted the artificial lighting. The crops were withering, some more than others, and her hands trembled as she worked. She had always been good at this, growing food in even the harshest of conditions. But this was different. The ship's resources were limited, and she was running out of time. How much longer do we have? She muttered to herself. How much longer before this all falls apart? She glanced over at Dr. Felix Riker, who had entered the room quietly, his eyes scanning the failing crops with a calculating look. As the ship's chief scientist, Felix had been working tirelessly to keep the life support systems operational, but even he was beginning to feel the weight of their situation. We're losing more crops every day, Felix said quietly, approaching her. The oxygen recyclers are functioning at 60% capacity. The water filtration systems are holding up for now, but only just. Ava's lips tightened. We can't keep going like this. If the crops fail, we'll starve. We won't have anything to fall back on. Felix's gaze softened, but there was a hard edge to his voice. I know, and I'm doing everything I can to help, but the reality is, we might not make it. Not unless something changes. Meanwhile, on the bridge, Captain Helena Core stood looking out into the vast emptiness of space, her mind racing with the weight of the decisions she would soon have to make. She could feel the tension growing within the crew. The mumbles of doubt, the whispers behind closed doors, the subtle but undeniable shift in the atmosphere. She knew it was coming, but now, with every passing day, the divide among them was becoming impossible to ignore. Captain Kai Tanaka, the ship's pilot, called from his station, breaking her thoughts. The trajectory is holding steady, but we're approaching a potential resource field. It's a good distance off, but if we can make it, we might be able to use the minerals there to help us boost the Exodus's systems. Helena turned to face him. His eyes were filled with determination, but there was something behind them, something that spoke of his growing anxiety. That sounds like a good lead, she said, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. But we can't afford to take unnecessary risks. If we push forward, we risk straining the ship even further. Every decision we make now is crucial. Kai looked at her, his expression unreadable. We have to take chances, Captain. We can't just drift out here and hope things get better. That evening, the crew gathered for their usual debriefing in the mess hall. But this time, the air was thick with tension. The usual chatter and light-hearted banter had been replaced by silence, punctuated only by the clinking of utensils against plates. The sense of unity that had once bonded them together was beginning to fray at the edges. Helena stood before them, her hands clasped behind her back, but even she couldn't hide the strain in her eyes. We need to address what's going on. I can feel the tension building, and it's not just in the food production bay or the engine rooms. It's here, in this room too. The crew is divided. She paused, scanning the faces before her. Felix, Ava, Kai, each of them had their own perspective, their own ideas on how to survive, but none of them were willing to back down, and that was beginning to tear them apart. Felix was the first to speak, his voice calm but firm. We're not just surviving anymore, Captain. We're gambling with our future. The resources we have are running out. The systems on this ship are failing. If we don't do something drastic, we'll be trapped here forever, and I'm not willing to let that happen. Helena's gaze hardened. You're suggesting what? That we risk everything for a quick fix? Felix met her gaze, unflinching. If we don't take risks, we'll never make it to the planet. You said it yourself, Captain. Our survival depends on finding a new home. But that's not going to happen if we keep playing it safe. We need to push, take the chance to find new resources and build something sustainable. Ava, who had been silent up until now, stood up from her seat, her face flushed with frustration. What you're suggesting, Felix, is reckless. We can't just throw caution to the wind. I've been working in the hydroponics bay every day trying to salvage what we have left. If we don't focus on sustainability, we'll end up losing more than just food. We'll lose everything. The argument was growing heated, voices rising, and Helena knew she had to intervene before it escalated further. Enough, she shouted, the power of her voice silencing the room. We're not going to get anywhere with infighting. This is about survival, and we need to be united if we're going to make it. Felix, Ava, both of you are right, and both of you are wrong. We can't afford to take unnecessary risks, but we can't afford to stand still either. A moment of silence passed, the weight of her words sinking in. Helena turned to face the crew, her eyes fierce. We're going to push forward, but we'll do it carefully. We'll explore this resource field, but only if we're sure we can handle it. We'll adapt, and we'll survive, together. But as the Exodus drifted forward, the underlying divide was far from resolved. The tension between Felix and Ava simmered just beneath the surface, and Helena could feel it. Feel how every decision, every move they made was now being weighed against the fear that any wrong choice could send them tumbling into disaster. As the ship moved further into the unknown, the clock was ticking louder with every second, and the crew was running out of time. The Exodus glided silently through the depths of space, its massive frame cutting through the emptiness like a lone ship lost in an infinite ocean. Yet within the ship's walls, there was little peace to be found. Tension had taken root among the crew, simmering below the surface, threatening to erupt at any moment. Helena could feel it in every corner of the ship. Unspoken fears, simmering resentment, and growing distrust. The very thing that had once kept them together now seemed to be pulling them apart. Approaching the resource field, Kai Tanaka's voice broke through the quiet hum of the ship, his tone filled with controlled urgency. It's a small asteroid cluster, but we should be able to extract minerals from it. Shouldn't be much of a risk unless we hit a larger chunk. Helena stood at the command center, watching as the screen displayed the approaching asteroid field. She glanced at Kai, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. They both knew that taking this risk was a gamble, but they had no choice. The ship's resources were dwindling faster than anyone anticipated. There was no way they could sustain their journey without securing more resources. We'll need to keep a close eye on the trajectory, Helena said, her voice sharp with command. One wrong move, and we're in trouble. Kai, make sure the shields are at full power. Felix, How are the life support systems holding up? Felix Riker, who had been monitoring the systems on his console, didn't answer right away. He was too focused on the fluctuating data. His face, usually calm and composed, was now etched with concern. "We're barely maintaining equilibrium," he finally said, his voice tight. "The oxygen levels are stable for now, but the recycling systems are struggling to keep up with the consumption rate. We can't afford to waste any more resources." Ava, standing by the food production monitor, turned to face them, her face pale with exhaustion. "And the crops? They're still failing, Helena. If we don't get a sustainable food source soon, we'll be out of options. I don't know how much longer we can keep up with this." Helena felt the weight of their words settle into her chest, but she couldn't afford to let it show. She couldn't afford to show fear. Not now, not when they were so close to what could be their salvation. "Everyone stay sharp," she said firmly. "This is a temporary measure. We'll get what we need and then we move on. We can't afford to let this become another obstacle." As the ship neared the asteroid field, the tension in the air thickened. The crew members were all silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts, the weight of their responsibilities pressing heavily on their shoulders. Kai's hands flew across the control panel, his fingers dancing over the buttons with practiced precision. "All right, I'm entering the field now. Stay alert." The Exodus lurched slightly as the ship adjusted its trajectory, gliding through the narrow gaps between the asteroids. The ship's shield began to hum softly, a reassuring sound in the midst of the growing tension. Suddenly, the ship jolted violently, throwing everyone off balance. The lights flickered and alarms blared as the ship was struck by debris. "Damage report," Helena barked, her voice commanding as she grabbed onto the railing to steady herself. "We've lost power to the starboard engines." Kai shouted over the sound of alarms, his hands flying over the control panel as he tried to stabilize the ship. "We've hit an asteroid. It wasn't on the scanners." Felix immediately went to the engineering console, pulling up diagnostics. "Hull breach. Minor, but it's affecting the oxygen recycling systems. We need to patch it up, or we'll lose more than just power." Ava rushed to the hydroponics bay, her face pale as she looked at the data flooding in. The systems were beginning to fluctuate more than usual, and the temperature in the bay had dropped. "We need to get to the breach," Felix said urgently, pulling on his suit. "Ava, I need you to help stabilize the environment. If those systems go offline, we'll lose the crops. We can't afford that." Helena stood at the command center, her mind racing with decisions. "Kai, stabilize the ship. Felix, Ava, patch up the breach and stabilize life support. I'll coordinate with the rest of the crew." The next few hours were a blur of frantic activity. The ship had been struck harder than they initially thought, and the damage was more severe than anyone had anticipated. The crew worked quickly to patch the breach, stabilize the power, and ensure that the life support systems didn't fail. But with each passing minute, the situation became more critical. By the time they had everything under control, the damage was done. They had lost more resources, and they had no way of knowing if the asteroid field would yield the minerals they needed. Helena stood in the command center, her hands clenched into fists as she looked at the data scrolling across the screen. The risk had paid off. Barely. They had secured some of the resources they needed, but at what cost? "Captain," Felix said, his voice soft but firm, "we can't keep taking these kinds of risks. Every time we push the ship, we're gambling with our future. The life support systems are too fragile." Helena turned to face him, her eyes hard with determination. "We don't have a choice, Felix. We either take risks or we die slowly in space. I'm not willing to let that happen." Felix sighed, his face shadowed with concern. "I understand, Captain, but every decision we make now has consequences, and the longer we wait, the more we risk." As the Exodus continued its journey through the cold vastness of space, the crew knew that they couldn't keep living on the edge. They were at a breaking point. The damage to the ship, the food shortages, the constant strain on their resources, it was all adding up. They couldn't keep surviving like this. Helena stared out at the endless stars once more. It felt as if the universe itself was watching, waiting to see whether humanity would rise again or fall into oblivion. But one thing was clear. Whatever came next, they had no choice but to face it, together. The Exodus hung in the cold void of space, a fragile shell of humanity's last hope. The ship's systems hummed with quiet energy, barely holding together after the damage from the asteroid field. It had been days since the collision, and the crew worked tirelessly to repair the ship and restore balance. But despite their best efforts, cracks were beginning to show in more than just the hull. Captain Helena Core sat in the command center, her eyes fixed on the monitor in front of her. The numbers were bleak. Power reserves were low, oxygen levels were fluctuating, and the food supply was reaching critical levels. Each passing day felt like a race against time, and the pressure of the weight on her shoulders was suffocating. She glanced at the crew's reports, each one more grim than the last. A soft chime interrupted her thoughts, and she looked up to see Felix standing by the door, his expression tight. He stepped forward, holding a tablet with the latest diagnostics. "Captain," Felix began, his voice measured but laced with frustration. "The ship is still operating at less than 50% efficiency. The repairs to the life support systems helped, but we're already losing more than we're gaining. The crops in the hydroponics bay are still failing, and we don't have enough food to last the next few weeks. We need more resources, and fast." Helena stood, the weight of his words sinking deep into her chest. "I know. I'm fully aware of the situation, Felix. We're doing everything we can. But what else can we do? Every time we take a step forward, we seem to be falling 2 steps back." Felix's gaze softened, but he didn't relent. "We can't keep pushing the ship like this. We need to find another way, or we'll burn through everything before we even reach the next potential resource field. If we keep this up, we'll run out of everything. Food, power, oxygen." Helena's jaw clenched as she stared out at the stars. "I don't have a choice. If we stop now, we die. The mission must continue." Felix didn't argue. He knew the weight of the decision. He had spent his career studying the limits of human endurance, but even he was beginning to doubt. Could they really survive in the depths of space, with limited resources, no answers, and nowhere to turn? Later that evening, as the crew gathered in the mess hall, the mood was tense. Conversations were hushed, and the usual chatter had been replaced with quiet murmurs. The crew was on edge, and it showed. They were no longer just surviving the voyage. They were beginning to wonder if they would even make it. Ava Sloan sat at the far end of the table, her fingers tapping nervously on the surface. She had been working non-stop in the hydroponics bay, but it was clear that the crops weren't responding to the artificial conditions. They were running out of time, and no matter how hard she worked, the system just wasn't working fast enough. The resources they had on board were dwindling, and there was nothing she could do to fix it. "We're not going to make it, are we?" Ava muttered under her breath, barely loud enough for the others to hear. Felix, who was seated next to her, glanced over. "What do you mean?" Ava shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "I mean, this. Us. The Exodus. The mission. It's all falling apart. We're fighting a losing battle here, Felix, and you know it." Felix didn't respond immediately, his eyes clouded with doubt. He had spent his whole life studying systems, studying survival. But now, with the Exodus barely holding together and the crew on the brink of collapse, he wasn't sure how much longer they could keep this up. Helena walked into the mess hall, her footsteps firm, her presence commanding. She scanned the room briefly before turning her gaze to the crew. "I know things have been difficult," she began, her voice carrying across the room. "I know there's fear, there's doubt. I feel it too, but we can't let it consume us. We're the last hope. We're all we have, and we will make it through this, together." Her words were powerful, but Helena could feel the skepticism in the room. She could see it in their eyes, the uncertainty, the fatigue. The cracks were starting to show, and she didn't know how much longer they could keep this facade of unity. But she couldn't give up. She couldn't let them see her doubt. Kai Tanaka stood up from his seat, his eyes meeting Helena's. "We're with you, Captain. You've led us this far. But we can't keep pretending everything's fine. We're running out of time, and we need a plan. A real plan." The room fell silent. Kai's words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Helena felt a surge of frustration, but she held it back. "We will find a way," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "We have to." Days turned into weeks, and the situation aboard the Exodus grew more dire with each passing hour. The crew worked tirelessly to patch up the ship's failing systems, but they were no longer just fighting external forces. The real battle was inside the ship, against doubt, against fear, and against the growing realization that they might not make it. Helena stood once more in the command center, staring out at the dark, silent stars. She felt the weight of it all pressing down on her chest. The choices, the responsibility. It was too much. She had always been a leader, always able to shoulder the burden of command, but now the weight felt unbearable. Every decision, every move, every word seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. Helena, Felix's voice broke through her thoughts, his tone soft, almost reluctant. We've got a problem with the engines. We're losing power. If we don't find a solution soon, we'll be adrift in space with no way to move forward. Her stomach dropped. She turned to face him, trying to steady her breathing. How bad is it? It's bad, Felix replied. We're running out of fuel and the engine systems are deteriorating faster than we can fix them. Without a source of energy, we'll be stuck here. Helena's mind raced. If they couldn't fix the engines, they'd be stranded. They'd run out of power, resources, and most importantly, time. What are our options? She asked, her voice tight with urgency. We need a resource, any resource, that we can use to power the ship, Felix said. We might be able to extract something from the asteroid field, but it's a long shot. We can't afford to waste time. Helena's heart pounded in her chest as she made her decision. Kai, plot a course to the asteroid field. We don't have a choice. We go now. As the crew scrambled to prepare for the mission, Helena stood in the command center, her eyes narrowing as the ship's engines came back online. The Exodus was still moving, still fighting, but at what cost? How long could they keep this up? The weight of survival, of leadership, was pressing down on her. The mission wasn't just about finding a new world. It was about keeping them alive long enough to find it. And deep down, she wasn't sure how much longer they had. The Exodus drifted through space, its hull creaking under the strain of yet another challenge. The ship had been patched up, the engines temporarily functional after their close call with power failure, but the tension within the crew was now palpable. Something had shifted, something Helena couldn't ignore anymore. The unity she had worked so hard to foster was cracking, and the fault lines were beginning to show in the most unexpected ways. The resource extraction mission had seemed like their only option. The asteroid field had promised much-needed minerals to sustain their power systems. But when the crew had returned to the ship with the raw materials, the reality of their situation hit harder than any asteroid strike. Helena stood on the bridge, her gaze fixed on the readouts in front of her. The energy readings from the asteroid field were insufficient to keep the ship running for long. They had acquired the resources, yes, but not nearly enough. They were still stuck, adrift in a cold, uncaring universe with no backup plan. Her heart sank as she looked over at the crew, each of them visibly worn, each of them feeling the strain of their isolation. Felix approached her quietly, his voice breaking the silence of the control room. Captain, we're running out of time. This isn't going to last. The engine repairs bought us a few extra days, but we're still on borrowed time. Helena didn't look at him. She couldn't. She had grown accustomed to the uncertainty, to the daily struggle to maintain control. But now it was different. They weren't just struggling to survive. They were struggling to stay human, to stay hopeful. I know, she said softly, her words carrying the weight of a leader who had no answers left. But we can't give up now. We've come too far. Felix's face tightened in frustration. Helena, we've done everything we can, but I don't know if it's enough anymore. The crew is losing faith. I'm losing faith, and I don't know how much longer I can keep telling them everything will be all right. A wave of guilt washed over her and she turned to face him. His words stung. There was truth in them. The cracks in the facade were no longer hidden. Ava, the ever-optimistic engineer, had retreated to the hydroponics bay, working alone for hours, her hands shaking as she tried to coax life from the failing crops. Kai, the once unshakable pilot, had taken to staring out at the endless stars for hours, his brow furrowed in thought. He no longer seemed certain that they would make it. The room grew quiet, the hum of the ship and the soft ticking of the instruments the only sounds breaking through the tense atmosphere. Helena knew she couldn't ignore it anymore. The divide between the crew was real. The stress, The fear, they were starting to erode the unity that had held them together in the beginning. She needed to act fast before it all fell apart. The mission wasn't just about reaching a new planet, it was about surviving together. The next day, the crew gathered in the mess hall, the air thick with unspoken tension. Helena had called for an emergency meeting. She could feel the stares as she entered the room, eyes filled with anger, disappointment, and even fear. They were no longer just a team, they were a group of people on the brink, a ticking time bomb waiting for the wrong spark. Ava was the first to speak, her voice tight with emotion. "This isn't working, Helena. We've been patching things up for months, but we're still heading straight for disaster. The crops are failing, the power systems are failing. How much longer can we keep pretending that everything is under control?" Helena stood at the front of the room and her jaw set in determination. "I'm not pretending, Ava. We've faced setbacks, yes, but we haven't given up yet, and I'm not going to let us give up now." Ava shook her head. "It's not about facing reality. We're out of options. We can't just keep trying to fix the unfixable." Felix, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. "Ava's right. We've tried everything, and every time we fix one problem, another one pops up. This ship is running on fumes, and we're running out of time. We need a new plan." Helena's heart sank, but she didn't show it. She could feel the trust slipping away from her, from the crew, and it stung deeper than any failure in battle ever had. "Then let's find a new plan," she said, her voice ringing with defiance. "We're not giving up. We will keep searching for a solution, together." But despite her words, Helena could feel the shift. The unity they had fought so hard to maintain was unraveling, piece by piece. No matter how strong her resolve, it wasn't enough to hold them together forever. That night, as Helena stood at the observation deck, gazing out at the endless expanse of stars, she couldn't help but wonder how long they could keep this up. The universe was vast, indifferent, and full of threats they had yet to comprehend. The Exodus was humanity's last hope, but what if that hope was already slipping through their fingers? A soft ping from her communicator broke the silence, and Helena turned to see a message from Kai. "Captain, we need to talk. Meet me in the flight deck." When she arrived in the flight deck, Kai was already there, standing in front of the massive windows that looked out into space. He didn't turn to face her as she entered, but his voice when he spoke was calm. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up," he said, his eyes staring into the abyss. "I've been flying for years, but this feels different. The weight of it all. The crew, they're all waiting for you to make the impossible work. But what if the impossible is just that?" Helena stood beside him, looking out into the stars. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the weight of their situation, the crushing reality of it. "We have no choice but to try," she said softly, almost to herself. "If we stop now, we die. We give up on everything we fought for. I won't let that happen." Kai finally turned to face her, his expression weary. "I'm with you, always. But the crew, they're not as strong as you think. They need more than just a captain who keeps pushing them forward. They need someone to guide them through this, not just in battle, but in their hearts." Helena's heart clenched, the enormity of his words sinking deep into her bones. For the first time, she realized that leadership wasn't just about making decisions, it was about keeping the faith, even when all hope seemed lost. "We will get through this," she said, her voice steady. "We have to." As the Exodus drifted through the silent blackness of space, its crew on the edge of collapse, Helena stood firm, her resolve hardening. The universe was vast, and humanity was fragile, but they had come this far, and she wouldn't let them fall now. There was still hope, however faint it seemed, but the cracks were showing, and time was running out. The Exodus moved through the cold, expanse of space with mechanical precision, but inside its walls, there was chaos. The divide between the crew members had deepened, a growing rift that threatened to undo everything they had worked for. The ship's fragile ecosystem, their last lifeline, was on the brink of collapse, and with it, any hope of survival. Helena stood in the command center, her gaze fixed on the star-streaked darkness outside the ship's window. The silence in the room was deafening, and the tension among the crew had reached a boiling point. They had survived so much, endured so many hardships, but this was different. This was the slow, suffocating kind of despair that took root in your chest and threatened to tear you apart from the inside. "Captain," Felix Riker said, his voice breaking through the stillness. He stood at the console, eyes locked on the display in front of him, his fingers moving in swift, precise gestures. "I've done everything I can, but the oxygen recyclers are still failing. The hydroponics bay is still struggling, the resources are almost gone." Helena didn't respond immediately. She could feel it. The weight of his words, the truth in them. They were running out of time. Every choice, every action had to count, but the reality was harsh. They'd already pushed the ship and themselves beyond their limits. And now it seemed the cracks were too deep to mend. "How long?" Helena asked, her voice steady but edged with the strain of uncertainty. Felix glanced at her, his eyes filled with the kind of exhaustion that only came from seeing your efforts crumble despite your best intentions. "Maybe a week, maybe less." A deep silence fell between them, the weight of those words hanging in the air like an anchor. Helena knew that they couldn't afford to waste any more time. They needed a solution. Fast. Hours later, in the hydroponics bay, Ava Sloan moved between the rows of crops, her hands trembling as she checked the plants for any sign of life. The once thriving growth had dwindled to mere shadows of its former self, withered and fragile. She was losing the battle, and with each passing moment, it felt like she was losing more than just crops. She was losing hope. "This isn't working," she whispered to herself, a knot of frustration building in her chest. "We're running out of time, and I can't save them. I can't save any of us." Her communicator buzzed, the voice of Felix crackling through. "Ava, we need you in the command center, now." With a sigh, she turned away from the plants, wiping her hands on her jumpsuit as she made her way to the bridge. The weight of the situation pressed down on her with every step. The Exodus wasn't just a ship anymore. It was a prison, a lifeboat stuck in space, drifting toward an uncertain future. When Ava arrived on the bridge, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Kai Tanaka was seated at the helm, his eyes scanning the monitor with a focused intensity. Helena stood at the front, her arms crossed over her chest, her expression unreadable. The crew had gathered in a loose circle, waiting for Helena to speak. "We're out of options," Helena said, her voice cutting through the quiet. "We need a new plan, and I'm not going to pretend anymore that we can keep doing what we've been doing." Ava glanced around at the others. Felix stood beside her, his gaze thoughtful but weary. Kai, the ever-steady pilot, was looking at her, his expression guarded. The truth was, they were all out of ideas. They had pushed every system to its limit, and now it was only a matter of time before the Exodus broke apart under the strain. "What are you suggesting, Captain?" Felix asked, his voice low but sharp. "We can't just keep going like this. We need something, anything, that can give us a real chance." Helena's gaze shifted to the crew, and for a moment it seemed like she was searching for something, an answer, a glimmer of hope that didn't exist. But she found nothing. She had no choice but to face the truth. "We need to find another planet," Helena said finally. "We can't keep relying on this ship and these systems. We need to find somewhere else to settle. A real home, a place where we can rebuild." The room fell silent. No one spoke for a long moment. The idea of leaving the Exodus behind, leaving everything they had worked for, felt like an impossible choice. But it was the only one they had left. "What if we can't find another planet?" Kai asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. "What if we're out here forever?" Helena met his gaze, her face hardening with determination. "Then we fight. We fight until we have nothing left to fight for. But we don't stop looking. Not now. Not ever." The next day, the crew set course for the nearest habitable star system, a distant hope hanging on the thin thread of their dwindling resources. The journey was long and uncertain, but each member of the crew knew that this was it. There was no going back. Felix worked on recalibrating the ship's systems, doing his best to keep things running, but even he couldn't deny that their options were running out. Ava, in the meantime, focused on whatever she could salvage from the hydroponics bay, but the crops were beyond saving. The resources on board were growing scarcer by the day. And then there was Kai. His eyes were no longer the steady, confident gaze of a pilot who had seen it all. Now they were filled with doubt, uncertainty. The cold, unfeeling void of space had begun to break him, just as it was breaking all of them. As the Exodus sailed through the dark, lonely void of space, the crew's final chance to survive grew smaller. Time was running out. But amid the bleakness, there was a quiet understanding that no matter what happened, they would face it together. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving that they could endure. They had come too far to give up now. They had to believe. The Exodus drifted silently through the void of space, its sleek frame a fragile beacon in the infinite darkness. Its systems were barely holding together, a patchwork of half-solved problems and temporary fixes. Inside, the crew was on edge, their eyes fixed on the slowly blinking lights of the control panels, each one a reminder of how close they were to running out of options. Helena Kor stood at the command center, the soft hum of the ship's engines a constant companion. She had spent hours in the last few days reviewing data, coordinating repairs, and talking to the crew. The reality of their situation was growing more undeniable by the hour. They had exhausted every option, pushed every system to its limits, and still, the Exodus was barely scraping by. "Captain," Felix's voice interrupted her thoughts. "We've hit a critical point. The power reserves are down to 15%. We won't make it another week without fuel, and the asteroid field is our last chance to scavenge anything." Helena's jaw tightened, her mind racing. They had already made the decision to go through the asteroid field in search of minerals that could keep the Exodus running, but they were running out of time. Every move, every calculation now carried the weight of their survival. "I know, Felix," she said quietly. "We need to make it work. We don't have another choice." Felix turned to her, his face etched with exhaustion. "I'm doing everything I can to keep this ship together, but we're running on borrowed time. We need more than minerals. We need a plan, Captain. A real one." Later that day, the crew gathered in the mess hall, a rare moment of calm before they would face the next challenge. The room was silent, the usual banter absent. Even Kai, who had always been the first to crack a joke in the darkest of times, sat quietly, his fingers drumming on the table absent-mindedly. Ava sat across from him, her face a mask of frustration. The crops in the hydroponics bay were dead, the system was failing, and the food supply was dwindling faster than she could process. There was no time for emotional conversations, no time for doubt. All she could think about was survival and the crushing weight of the task ahead. "We've got another problem," Ava finally spoke, breaking the silence. "The backup power generators aren't going to last more than a few days. We're already losing efficiency with every hour. We can't keep this up much longer." Helena looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each member of the crew. Felix, Ava, Kai, all of them were staring back at her, waiting for her to make the next move. They were looking to her for guidance, for something to hold on to. But for the first time since the beginning of this mission, Helena wasn't sure she had the answers. "We'll get through this," Helena said, her voice firm, but the doubt in her chest lingered. "We always do." But even as she spoke, a gnawing fear settled deep within her. Could they really survive this? Could she keep them together? Keep them moving forward when everything was falling apart? The following hours were a blur of activity. The Exodus moved slowly toward the asteroid field, the tension palpable in every corner of the ship. Each member of the crew had a role to play, and they worked like clockwork, their motions precise but robotic. There was no time for anything else. Kai navigated the ship through the asteroid field, his hands steady on the controls. He'd done this 1,000 times before, but this time it felt different. The stakes were higher. If they didn't secure the minerals from the asteroid field, there would be no chance of making it to a new home. "We're entering the field," Kai said, his voice low but tense. "This is where it gets tricky." The ship vibrated as they passed through the outer edge of the field, the massive rocks floating just inches away from their hull. The Exodus was a giant, but even it was vulnerable in this field of danger. Each asteroid was a potential hazard, a threat to their fragile existence. The crew was quiet, their attention focused entirely on the mission. But the atmosphere was thick with an unspoken fear, the fear that this might be the last chance they would have. Suddenly, the ship jolted violently, throwing everyone off balance. The lights flickered and alarms began blaring across the control panels. "We've taken a hit!" Kai shouted, his voice rising with the shock. "We're losing power to the starboard side. Stabilize it now." Helena barked, her voice sharp as she grabbed onto the nearest console. "Felix, report!" Felix rushed to his console, his fingers flying over the controls. "We've sustained a hull breach. It's minor for now, but we're losing power. If we don't fix it fast, we'll be stranded." "We can't afford to be stranded," Helena said through gritted teeth. "Get us to the asteroid field and secure those minerals. Now!" The minutes that followed felt like hours. The crew worked together in silence, their movements urgent and focused. Kai continued to navigate through the asteroid field, avoiding the larger rocks with expert precision. Felix worked to stabilize the ship's power, rerouting energy where he could, while Ava was already setting up the extraction equipment for the minerals they so desperately needed. Despite their best efforts, the ship was barely holding together. The constant jolts from passing asteroids were taking a toll, and the Exodus was starting to show signs of wear. The longer they stayed in the field, the more vulnerable they became. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the crew managed to extract enough resources to stabilize the ship's power for a few more days. But it was a temporary fix. Helena knew it. Felix knew it. They all knew it. The question that loomed over them was simple. How long could they keep this up before the Exodus finally gave out? As the ship finally cleared the asteroid field and began its slow, painful journey onward, Helena found herself standing at the observation window once again, staring out into the void. The Exodus was a lifeline, fragile, battered, and worn, but it was still moving. It was still alive. But for how much longer? Helena didn't have an answer, and that, more than anything, terrified her. The Exodus drifted silently through the void, its once pristine hull now marked with the scars of battle. The crew had fought hard to keep the ship alive, to keep their mission intact, but the reality of their situation was becoming increasingly clear. They were out of time, out of options. The asteroid field had provided a temporary solution, but the resources they had gained were not enough to change the inevitable. The ship's systems were failing. The crops were gone. The food supplies were almost depleted. Helena Kor stood at the command center, her hands gripping the edge of the console, her gaze fixed on the dark expanse of space outside. It felt as though the universe itself was waiting for them to make their move, to decide their fate. But what could they do now? The dream of a new home seemed further away than ever. "Captain, we're approaching the next resource field." Kai Tanaka's voice broke through the silence, his tone sharp, focused. "It's our last chance. We either find enough minerals to keep going, or we risk everything." Helena's heart sank. She didn't want to make this choice. She didn't want to push the crew any further, but she knew that they had no other option. The planet they had been searching for was still light years away, and the ship could barely hold together. But if they didn't try, they would have no future at all. "Plot a course," she said, her voice steady but filled with a tension that echoed through the bridge. "Let's make this our last chance." As Kai worked the controls, Felix stepped forward, his face grim. "Helena, we can't keep doing this. We're pushing everything to the limit. The ship is on the brink of collapse. If we keep going, we risk everything. We might not make it back if we push through this." A wave of frustration washed over Helena. She knew Felix was right. There was no more room for error. The Exodus was a ticking time bomb, and they were running out of time. But what choice did they have? "I know, Felix," she replied quietly, "but we don't have another choice. If we don't go for it, we'll die here. We need that resource. We need something to keep us going, and we're going to keep moving forward. Together." Felix didn't argue, but the tension between them was palpable. The truth was they were all afraid. Afraid of what would happen if they failed. Afraid of the unknown dangers they were about to face. The Exodus veered into the resource field, its engines straining under the pressure. The crew worked feverishly, trying to extract what they could from the minerals in the field, each movement more urgent than the last. But as the ship rumbled, shaking violently, the sound of alarms blaring cut through the air, sending a shockwave of panic through the crew. "Status report," Helena shouted, her voice commanding as she gripped the console. "We've lost power to the rear thrusters." Felix's voice came through, strained. "We're being pulled into the field. We're going to hit an asteroid if we don't regain control now." Helena's heart raced. She could hear the fear in Felix's voice, the unspoken truth that they were running out of time. They were too close, too far into the asteroid field to turn back. "Kai, get us out of here!" Helena yelled, but her words were lost in the roar of the ship's engines as they strained against the gravitational pull of the field. "We're losing control." Kai's voice was filled with desperation as the ship veered dangerously toward an asteroid cluster. "We can't maneuver. The damage is too severe." In the chaos, Ava Sloan scrambled to the hydroponics bay, her eyes wide with panic. She had seen the ship's damage firsthand, and now the thought of losing it all was too much to bear. The crops had failed, there was nothing left to harvest, no way to sustain them for much longer. The idea of being trapped in space with no resources, no hope, was a crushing weight she couldn't escape. She ran through the corridors, her breathing heavy, until she reached the control room. "Captain!" she shouted, panic rising in her chest. "The life support systems are failing. We're running out of oxygen. If we don't get those minerals, it's over." The ship continued to shake violently as the asteroid field loomed ahead, its jagged rocks ready to tear the Exodus apart. Helena could feel the pull of gravity, the crushing force that threatened to pull them into the abyss. Her hands were steady, but inside, a storm of fear and doubt raged. But then, in the midst of the chaos, something unexpected happened. A small, faint signal appeared on the radar. It was weak, barely perceptible, but it was there. Helena froze. Her heart skipped a beat. The signal, it was coming from a nearby planet. A real, habitable world. "Hold on," she shouted to the crew. "I'm locking onto a new trajectory. This is it. The planet, we found it." In that moment, the crew came together. There was no time for fear, no room for doubt. They had one last shot, and they would take it. The ship's engines roared as they adjusted course, the Exodus veering away from the asteroid field and toward the faint signal. But it wasn't enough. The ship was still falling apart, the damage too severe to make it a smooth journey. Ava, Kai, Felix, everyone worked together, pushing the ship beyond its limits, each person doing their part to keep the dream alive. They knew that this was the last chance. If they failed, if the ship couldn't hold together for just a little longer, it would all be over. The journey to the planet was perilous, but it was the only path forward. They had no idea what awaited them on this new world. But in that moment, as the Exodus continued its desperate journey, one thing was clear. This was their last hope. The question was no longer whether they could survive, but whether they could hold on to that last flicker of hope long enough to reach it. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey with the Exodus crew. If you enjoyed the adventure, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the story. Do you think humanity will find salvation, or are they doomed to extinction? Your support helps our channel grow and brings you more thrilling sci-fi stories. Stay tuned for the next chapter of Lost in Space, because the journey is far from over.